get started. My name is Alyssa Palazzo. I'm the editor for Sociology, Anthropology, and Women's Gender and Sexuality Studies at Rowman and Littlefield. And I'm so excited to have Eduardo and David with us today for a discussion on systemic racism and colorblindness in the context of healthcare. He hardly needs an introduction, but Eduardo Bonilla-Silva is the James B. Duke Distinguished Professor of Sociology at Duke University, the recipient of the W.E.B. Du Bois Career of Distinguished Scholarship Award from the American Sociological Association. He is the author of numerous books, including Racism Without Racists, White Logic, White Methods, and others. He has also served as president of the Southern Sociological Society and the American Sociological Association. Joining Eduardo, we have David G. Embrick. David is an associate professor with a joint position in the Africana Studies Institute and the Department of Sociology at the University of Connecticut. He is director of research on resilient cities, racism, and equity at UConn Hartford, a former president of the Southwestern Sociological Association and the Association for Humanist Sociology, and he's also served as the past founding co-editor of the highly ranked academic journal, Sociology of Race and Ethnicity. And with that, I'm going to hand it off to Eduardo.
Well, I guess we can hand it off to Eduardo, but I will start by saying hello to the audience. Thank you for being here, and hello, Eduardo Bonilla-Silva. Glad to see you again. It's been like a long time since you and I mean, I see you all the time, but it's been a long time since we've actually co-taught. You know, I think the last time when I was in grad school, and you sort of forced me to teach 70% of your class.
Actually,
but it was good. It was good.
Whatever. It wasn't 70%. It was like 50-50, and it was training. What's in, what's out.
It's wax in, wax out. So let's start with the excitement about what's new in this 6th edition.
Well, since you talk about you and I teaching, so let's remind the audience that I do cartoons. That's a bad representation of me because I was drawing with the mouse. But you know what? I kept working at it, and I think this is a good representation of David. I think it looks similar to you. Okay, so what is new in the 6th edition? I added a chapter on colorblind racism in pandemic times, where I address how colorblind racism, as the dominant ideology of the post-civil rights era, shaped discussions on pandemic-related issues such as essential workers, hunger, and health disparities. And since we're talking about health, let me address then something that I discussed in the chapter. So, for example, during the pandemic, we know that President Trump said things about the differential mortality, COVID mortality between whites and non-whites, and then he pondered, but why is it that the African American community is so much numerous times more than everybody else, meaning dying? We want to find the reason for it. And Dr. Fauci, and we love Dr. Fauci, but he's not perfect, ponder aloud. It's very sad. It's nothing we can do about it right now. In truth, we could have done some things, but that's another story. So I think that by not discussing the structural causes, meaning systemic racism and racialized class structure matters, then commentators ended up blaming the victims. That is, using the biologization and cultural racism frames of colorblind racism to explain health disparities. So we want to understand different mortality rates in terms of COVID. So we need to talk about the American apartheid and how that apartheid that we have in terms of neighborhoods affects mortality rates. The fact that poor communities of color don't have equal access to decent food. They live in areas that are classified as food deserts. There are no supermarkets nearby. People of color in general are 3 times less likely to have access to parks. They are what scholars call nature deprived. They don't have good quality sidewalks in their neighborhoods, so therefore walking in the streets as a form of exercise is not feasible. We also, and this is not just poor people of color, it's all of us, deal with racialized stress, as David Williams at the School of Public Health at Harvard has amply shown. And then we are overrepresented among essential workers, meaning those workers that were exposed to the virus because they were delivering stuff or working in supermarkets and the like. Yeah. So instead of showing those arguments and those causes, people like Jerome Adams, who was Surgeon General under Trump, basically blamed the victims and claimed that people of color eat the wrong food or drink too much alcohol or drugs, etc. And that's the reason for differential mortality. And of course, for Puerto Ricans in the audience, I have to confess, I do like mofongo power. So that's one of the new things in this edition. I also added, David, a chapter on what is systemic racism. And you and I, David, have been at this for a long, long time. And you have been telling me for at least 15 years that the book needed a more robust theoretical chapter. And the reason why I didn't have that was because in edition 1, I was told that theory is not that relevant. And they told me, put like 3-4 pages of theory, and that is enough. Let the data make the case. Well, data without theory is nothing, or is problematic and limited. So in this version of the book, in this edition, I added a more systematic understanding and discussion of systemic racism.
You know what, Eduardo, I think I appreciate the fact that you added in chapter 2. I've been telling, like, I've been with you since the first edition of this book, and I predicted, and I think my prediction has come true, that as you started to write more and more editions of the book, what would happen is that people would get too caught up with colorblind racism, and they would do lazy sociology, right, or lazy research, and not sort of look back on your previous work and make the connections between the racialized social system theoretical framework and colorblind racism. So I'm pretty glad that you at least included some of that to make a more holistic picture of what's going on.
Yeah, so in this version, I added, those of you who know my work know that in 1997, I published this paper, Rethinking Racism Toward the Structural Interpretation in the American Sociological Review, where I basically challenged the prejudice paradigm. And that prejudice paradigm that is so popular in the academy, I think is the same version that people in the streets have, the bad apples theory of race and racism, is the same one that we have in the academy, except we're a bit more refined. So what I added was this notion of racialized social systems, by which I mean societies where social, economic, political, economic, cultural, and even psychological rewards are partially allocated by race. And I say partially for obvious reasons. Although I am known as a race scholar, I'm not an idiot. So I know that in the matrix of domination in complex societies like ours, it's not just about race, it's also about class, gender, sexual orientation. Yeah. So fundamentally, not to bore you with theory today, what I have been arguing is that we need to move away from our focus on the rabid races and focus more on the collective practice and mechanisms that reproduce race inequality.
I mean, obviously, the analytical focus should be placed on the collective racial behavior of whites, but talk a little bit more about why do individual whites behave in ways that reproduce the racial and social order? Maybe think a bit beyond Bloomer's work on group position.
So since edition 1, I had this notion of the white habitus, and David, you know the deeper story of the notion of habitus. I initially didn't use the term habitus that is connected to Bourdieu. I had a more American-centered notion of lifestyle, and a reviewer didn't like it. So therefore, I went and in the manuscript and typed find lifestyle replaced with habitus. That's why I ended up having the habitus term. Again, that's a story for those interested in sociology of knowledge. Be that as it may, what I argue is that we need to understand how the way that whites live their lives, the segregation they experience in terms of schools, in terms of neighborhoods, in terms of friends, in terms of churches, etc., produces segregation of hearts, meaning their emotions, their beliefs, their sense of aesthetics, what is beautiful, who is beautiful. All that is sort of deeply shaped by this white socialization, which in combination with the racialized culture and structure of the country, indeed, the racialized culture and structure of the world, because racism is not a prerogative of this country, it's a world systemic phenomenon. So those things together then produce the views and habits that whites develop, which reflect their position in society. Therefore, they don't need, by the way, this is a teacher instructing white kids, and I know they don't look like white kids. I told you I was drawing with this, with the mouse, so give me a break, please. So they don't need to go to a school where they are taught, children, repeat after me, I'm not a racist, Bob, because in truth, the school of whiteness is the white habitus. And therefore, overall, we need to get off the focus on the bad apple. By the way, it took me a lot, David, you know, it took me a long time to draw that apple, and the worm going through the apple was painful. Anyway, so we need to focus more on RWF, regular white folks. The more we focus on the racists, on the traditional Archie Bunkers of the world, the less we understand that a system of race domination needs to incorporate most actors. Therefore, from slavery onward, actually from the genocide of the native peoples onward, it has been about the average white person being incorporated into the systemic racial order.
Look, you're throwing a lot at us, and you know, I think you've been thinking about racism and how to best understand racism for over 30 years now, and that's a long time. That's a long time from which you introduced us to the racialized social system theoretical framework, the colorblind racial ideology. You just went over white habitus, and now you're talking about the new racism regime. What exactly are you talking about here when you talk about this new racism regime?
So in the U.S. history, when we think about periods of racial domination, most people begin with slavery. In truth, we have to begin before that. We have to begin with the genocide and land theft endured by indigenous peoples, yeah? And that was followed by this, by the way, that genocide and that land dispossession and taking of resources continues till today, not just in the US, but in the world system. Indigenous people are still suffering the effects of settler colonialism, yeah? Then going back to the US, so we talk about that moment, then slavery, and then Jim Crow, and then we lack a way of understanding what is the nature of the system that reproduced race inequality in the post-civil rights moment. And in my work, by the way, you said, David, 30 years, it's 29. Don't make me feel old. Anyway, I'm 60, but looking 59. So I argued that there is, David, that's a joke. You can laugh because I need some feedback. Remember we talked about this? Anyway, thank you. Thank you for the forced laugh. Okay, so the new racism refers to these collective practices that emerge in the post-civil rights era that tend to be seemingly non-racial and that avoid directness, overt characteristics, such as the prevalent way that discrimination happens is what some scholars call smiling discrimination. People of color in the audience know what I'm talking about, yeah? We go to a store and immediately we're attacked and killed with politeness, yeah? Politeness that is discriminatory because they tell us, may I help you? May I help you? I'm just looking, may I help you? Yes, you can help me. I'm trying to steal this fancy code, and I was wondering if you could give me some ideas about how to accomplish this task. And people are like, oh, I didn't mean it like that. Of course you did. And some of you saw this video that went viral a few years ago of a young African-American in a store. And as you can see in picture one, he's in one aisle, and there is this person behind a clerk. Then he moves to another aisle, same clerk, move to another aisle, same clerk. Again, the covert nature of discrimination. Then the traditional racist terminology has also sort of disappeared for the most part from public discourse. Doesn't mean that we don't have it. The N-word is still used out there in private white spheres, but in public we avoid directly racist terminology. And we have even developed a new language of race to talk about race without naming blacks or people or Latinos, etc. So we call them urban people, urban problems, urban music, urban everything. Yeah? And for more on this, you may want to check chapter 3, the new racism in this edition, which, by the way, David, we also updated that in this edition.
I want to switch gears just a little bit because I know that in your previous research and your previous talks, you've talked a lot about HWCUs. And for the audience sake, this is what you define as historically white colleges and universities. And you've been talking about this for a while now, and specifically that you've mentioned that, or you've argued that racism has become embedded within organizations and institutions. And can you talk a little bit more about this and maybe expand upon sort of the notion of institutional racism?
So David, you and I go back a while, and you know that around, what, 12, 13 years ago, I coined this idea of HWCUs, historically white colleges and universities, because it was clear to me that Black colleges had their racial character tattooed in the name, yeah? HBCUs, the Hispanic serving institutions, indigenous colleges, whereas white colleges were viewed as just colleges and universities. So I decided to sort of develop a term. And I know some in the audience know that there is an alternative term, PWI, predominantly white institutions. And I'll tell you why I prefer my concept. First, because I coined the concept, but also because the PWI focuses too much on the demography. And again, I wrote about this in a recent paper with my former student now, Dr. Crystal Peoples, in the American Behavioral Sciences. So what I claim is that these places have a history, demography, curriculum, climate, and set of symbols and traditions that reproduce whiteness. And therefore, we need to think about how this conglomerate of factors produce a structure and a culture that exudes and exalts whiteness. I'm assuming many members of the audience are in these HWCUs. So you know that every, April or so, you have these traditional racist incidents, yeah, that the university administrators frame as isolated incidents. I put that in quotation mark because they keep happening again and again and again, suggesting that they're not isolated, and therefore you need to understand the structure that causes that these incidents keep happening again and again and again. And as important as it is for us, David, to understand these incidents, we need to also understand the deeper way in which whiteness shapes these places. Yeah? So think about the curriculum. And again, in the book that Alisa mentioned, White Logic, White Methods, we talk about this white logic. Yeah. So everything in the curriculum, almost everything, sort of is reflective of white culture. Yeah. Even the life in the college is white-centered, which explains why when we check surveys on climate issues, white students love these places, and students of color tend to feel ostracized and not good in these spaces. Even the food served in events, David, tends to be white-oriented. So, for example, here you have the chicken wrap sandwich, and I don't know why, but you know, I'm telling you this, David. If I eat another chicken wrap sandwich, I will die because I have eaten too many. Yeah. So you also have all these symbols. You have in the middle picture, you have in UNC, Silent Sam, so a Confederate statue that was removed during the 2020 uprisings, yeah? And then you have the last picture is of Venus as a symbol of beauty, and some in the audience may be pondering, so what is wrong with that? Nothing wrong, except that if you only have one representation of beauty, that is white beauty, you are then sort of forcing everybody else into normativity. Normativity is whiteness. So what about the whiteness? The beauty of people like David, Asian Americans or African Americans or indigenous peoples, Black folks, or the most beautiful group in the world, Afro-Latinos like myself, yeah? So where are our representations of beauty in these campuses, yeah? Then you also have, David, building after building named after white folks, making us feel like we don't belong, like we are at best guests in these spaces.
Blah, 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 blah. Look, this is all, look, Eduardo, this is all interesting. But I think what most people in the audience are here for and what they want to know is that if racism is embedded within the organizations, within institutions, and here we're talking about colleges and universities, churches, and the workplace, what about the health field? What about the health field in general?
Well, let me begin by saying that I resent the blah, 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 blah. I think this is important, valuable information. And I know where you live, man. Anyway, so obviously the burning question is whether or not the health system broadly defined, yeah, inclusive not just of hospitals and doctors, but also social workers, psychologists, etc. So whether or not that field is also racialized or representative, or whether or not systemic racism is embedded in the health system, and the answer is absolutely yes. In terms of doctors, only 11% of doctors are Black or Latino, even though Blacks and Latinos are about 32% of the population in the US. And some in the audience may be thinking, but a doctor is a doctor, and sort of think like Michael Jackson. It don't matter if you're Black or white. The truth is that the data is in, and it does matter if you're Black or white, because white doctors are significantly less likely to work in, let me use the new racism language, in urban areas, yeah? So they don't go to Detroit, they don't go to Ferguson, they don't go to any Black or Latino, Hartford, Connecticut, David, where you work, they probably don't want to work there, yeah? We also have books documenting the history of how racism has affected the medical field, and this particular book, Medical Apartheid, is a good coverage, or a book that covers quite well the history from slavery onward, yeah? And David, now there are books, book after book, it's a cottage industry of books specifying how racism affects a field like gynecology or psychiatry. This particular book, David, is interesting to me because before I was a race scholar, so those of you who know my career, I used to be a vulgar Marxist, class was everything. But for some reason, I purchased this book in 1986, and I still have it somewhere in my office, yeah? We also know that in terms of the US, we have, and in the world, we have this eugenics program supposedly to improve the health of the population. Improve meaning let's clean up and select positively for middle class elite people, and then limit the reproduction of poor folks, particularly poor folks of color, yeah? In case of Black women, some of you know, there was something called the Mississippi appendectomy, where Black women, without wanting or requesting it, were suffering hysterectomy, mostly through trickery or deceit. Everybody in this audience knows about the Tuskegee experiment, whereby folks in the Tuskegee Institute were recruited, yeah, in the area, in Alabama, to be in this project. And even though it was supposed to be a study on syphilis, by the 1940s, they had discovered that penicillin cured syphilis, and rather than stopping the project and then giving penicillin to all the subjects, they continued the practice and not giving any of them penicillin. That was discovered almost 30 years later, and that's when they finally stopped this experiment. But I want to alert you, David, and look at me. This is me, angry me. David, you like it? David,
it reflects you. It reflects you most of the time.
Most of the time, angry Eduardo. So I'm an angry bird. So it's not so much I want to focus on this. It's not so much the legacies. And although legacies matter, what we need to examine are the contemporary practices of racialization that produce race-based health disparities. So the conscious and unconscious is merged in the medical field. And generally speaking, David, you know me, business Eduardo, I usually don't give props to other folks, but John Haberman, who is a professor at the University of Texas, Austin, of Germanic studies of all areas, has written like 3 or 4 books dealing with Blacks in the medical field. And in this particular book, Black and Blue, and he said, those of you who have checked the book, it's a really hard to read book because you see report after report, article after article from the late 19th century till today, showing that mainstream American medicine has absorbed traditional stereotypes about Black folks and produced misguided interpretations of Black children, elderly Black people, Black athletes, Black pain thresholds, and other aspects of Black minds and bodies. So we know that, David, white doctors do believe that Black patients have a higher pain threshold. So for example, a study in 2012 of pediatricians after giving surgery to their patients, meaning patients are children. So rather than giving them the oxycodone, the potent medication, they gave them ibuprofen. Those of you who have endured a surgery know that a day or two after the surgery, you need really strong medication to deal with pain until the pain subsides. Yeah. We also know that other studies show that Black patients presenting chest pain, and when someone is presenting chest pain, you have to suspect maybe this is a heart attack. Yeah. But they are 30% less likely to receive an electrocardiogram, X-ray, cardiac rhythm, or oxygen saturation monitoring. So that again potentially could be lead to death. Lastly, we do have all this research, and it is not on doctors, it's on all whites, showing, and this particular study reported by CNN. I went and checked the original paper, and it was written by these Italians, because after all, racism is global. So what these researchers found, and again in the US, the study has been replicated, is that white folks lack pain empathy towards Black folks. So the experiment is this. They take a needle, and they have a video clip showing a Black hand and a white hand with the needle going through, and then they connect the subjects in the experiment with all kinds of sensors to see how they react, and they find that they're less likely to feel empathy towards Blacks. This situation, David, continues today because in 2020, there was a study by a professor at the University of Washington showing that 50% of the students, medical students, believe that Black people have different skin and different nerve endings. And again, David, you and I are social scientists, so we know that when a report says that 50% of any population believes something, these are the people who acknowledge. So we have to believe that the larger proportion of white students in medicine believes that Black people have this different way of dealing with pain. Yeah, and this goes back to the history of domination. When you need to brutalize and exploit the population, you have to develop a stereotypical view of them. You have to believe that they are stronger, sturdier, that they can take more work, more abuse, more pain, more sun, more light, more rain. The second element we know about the doctors is that they are, in general, less connected and comfortable with people of color. By the way, I'm talking about doctors. The same can be said about other spaces, David, including the academy. Yeah? So in general, all the research that I have seen shows that they feel less affiliated with Black patients, that they don't think we are pleasant, and that they don't believe that we are the kind of people that they can see themselves becoming friends with. So what is the implication of this lack of connection and comfort with us? Well, the work of my former colleague, Chairman James, shows that if you don't feel comfortable, if you don't feel connected to us, then during the interaction, you spend less time, you don't listen to us, and then you don't take the time to explain well what is going on and what kind of things we should do. And David, as I was preparing these notes, I was thinking, I've been at Duke now 17 years. My doctors have never explained to me the side effects of my meds. So I was checking 2 days ago, and some of the things that you and I know that I have been experiencing some things, yeah, have to do with one of the medications they're giving me. They just gave me the medication and never explained it to me.
Wow. Yeah. So we have data, obviously, on racial disparities, and we have data on the racialized beliefs of many doctors, right? The racial stereotypes that they buy into. So, and you pointed some of this out just a minute ago, that Black patients, for example, have a higher threshold for pain. That's what some white doctors adamantly believe. So are there data out there about how white doctors think about racial inequalities or inequities or disparities in the health field? Isn't their mantra, first, do no harm?
They may have the mantra, but they are also racialized as whites and therefore absorb a lot of views about people of color. And in general, they believe that we don't eat right, we smoke, we drink, we use alcohol, we don't follow doctors' advice, we don't go often to the doctors, again, assuming that healthcare is egalitarian. We know that people of color tend to be poorer, therefore less likely to have access to the healthcare system, yeah? So in general, their view is something like this: anything but racism. Now, interestingly, again, I'm assuming many people in the audience know this, in general, despite the common sense view that people of color are the ones who are smoking and drinking, etc., it is white folks who are more likely to drink, smoke, and take drugs. That is a finding that keeps being uncovered again, again, and again. So in general, what you have is this cartoon, David, of Dr. White objectivity. Yeah? I'm an objective doctor and do not see color, just patients. Besides, I voted for Obama twice, and I love Michelle and the girls. I support the NAACP, and I love Dr. Tyrone Blackman. So we don't talk about systemic racism, or they'll call me a racist.
Yeah, this thing about white objectivity is for real, right? One of the things I like about your book in general, right? I mean, I think you could have done a better job, but there's a section on there about are blacks colorblind, right? So let me ask you this question: What about people of color? What about folks of color? How do people of color see racial matters in the health field?
Thank you for your kind comment about my book. Could have been better, but I think it's pretty good. So what do people of color in medicine think about the system? They know that if you're a doctor, your patients may not want you to deal with them. You may not want you to touch them. Your colleagues treat you differently. Even nurses and staff treat you differently. Again, David, we're talking about the medical field, but in the academy, it's sort of the same, yeah? Differential treatment. So racism in medicine is not an abstract notion, it's for real, yeah? And it's happening all around us every day, yeah? And this case, I'm sure that many people in the audience recall Dr. Susan Moore, who died in Indiana University Health Hospital, and she had COVID, was hospitalized, complained of severe neck pain, and asked, she's a doctor, okay? She's an MD, and asked for medication, and they denied her medication because they thought she was looking for pain meds. And she did this video, again, it went viral, where she said at the end, I put forth and I maintain, if I was white, I wouldn't have to go through that. And I'm part of the data, so I want to give you one personal anecdote that illustrates many of the points I'm making today. So I went to my doctor to do my physical, and my doctor told me at the very end of the exam, anything else? I said, well, I'm always angry and anxious and stressed and this and that. And he told me, don't worry, we have one of the best clinical psychologists in the nation. This person is great. I use her myself, and she has been great for me. So I made an appointment, and I went to the visit, and I told her, well, I'm angry all the time. I feel stressed, I'm not happy with my job, and raise this and that and this and that. And then she stopped me and said, hold on, you foreigners. For the audience, I happen to be Puerto Rican, born in Bellefonte, Pennsylvania, 60 years ago. So I'm American, whether I was born here or in Puerto Rico, but I happen to have been born here, yeah? So hold on, you foreigners need to speak slowly and use simpler words and shorter sentences. So say it again, okay? As you can imagine, I wasn't too happy with this interaction, and I wanted to leave, but I'm also a cheap person. David knows this quite well. So I decided to stay and say, well, I already paid, I'm going to be charged half an hour, so let me see. And I went crazy, asking me all kinds of things, David. She's asking me to say, okay, for you to relax, you need to do this. And then she told me, do that and try to vibrate your leg. And I'm like, ma'am, I don't know what the heck you're talking about. And so she started showing me, I'm like, this is some crazy stuff. You know? Interestingly, David, so I left the visit, and by the way, I'm telling you, David, I'm getting emotional. This when you revisit these incidents, it comes back to you. So I'm in my office 3 days later, and there is a call, and it's the woman, and she left a message. Hello, Dr. Bonilla. She couldn't pronounce my name, so Dr. Bonilla-Silva. And now I'm doctor, yeah? I think I said something problematic, meaning racist. Anywho, I think I can help you, and please, I hope that this doesn't affect our relationship. We have nothing. Anyway, and please come back later. And I obviously didn't go. So that's that, David.
Yeah. Wow. I don't think you told me that before. I feel like sort of the transference of racial microaggressions here. But you said a lot. There's a lot to unpack here. But can you just do a quick sum up for us how racism works in the health field?
So basically two things. First, the first thing is that we should get away from the bad apples and thinking there is a bad nurse or a bad hospital or a bad doctor or a bad social worker, and think more about how the organization, whether it's a hospital or a school of social work or public health, how normative whiteness shapes the organization. And secondly, how white practitioners reproduce the racial order in conscious and unconscious ways.
Let's get back to the individual actor, because I think this is where a lot of the confusion lies, right? So why would, and you called it Dr. White objectivity. So why would Dr. White objectivity behave in ways that reproduce the racial and social order? Why would they not just be objective? Doctors helping everyone equally. What's your take on that?
Yeah. Hey man, you skip. Anyway, okay. Because we're not thinking of Dr. White objectivity. Yeah, it's not Dr. Kevin, nurse Crystal, social worker Jonathan, clinical psychologist Jessica. It is that they are members of the racial group and become, and I'm borrowing here from Karl Marx in Capital, yeah, they become unconscious personifications of the American racial order. David, at some point you and I need to go back and rework in a deeper way this notion of the white habitus, because I'm convinced that there is a lot to milk out of that. That is central for the reproduction of racial order, yeah? And of course, as I said, there is no school. White folks don't go to night schools and repeat after me. So therefore, even the white habitus does not perfectly construct every white person. There is variance among whites. There are some whites who become like John Brown, anti-racist, whether they're doctors or not, yeah? But in general, a system is a system because it develops strategies to keep people in check, to make sure that most of the members of the dominant group, whether it's this case of race or class or gender, etc., most members of the dominant group in any system sort of follow the path of least resistance. Now, of course, again, there is variance. There are some whites who are like a little bit creamy, and some of them become brown and sort of migrate out of whiteness. But again, most of them end up reproducing racial order, including David, and this is for a deeper discussion, including many, many people who claim to be race liberals and even progressive. I think that the more they claim and proclaim and beyond race, the deeper racism has filtered into their souls. For more on this, on how the fractures exist and variance among whites and the things that we might do to fight the power, there is a book that may be helpful. You know, I always do a commercial.
Yeah. I mean, I'm game for all kinds of things, but you got to know that I'm not that cheap graduate student anymore. So, but I got one more question for you.
One more question.
Yeah. This is a big one. This is probably the most important one of all. I mean, I know that a lot of people have already used your book. A lot of people read your book. There's a lot of readers here probably that have read the previous editions of your book, and we want to know, and it includes myself, like how your conclusion, right? We want to know about the conclusion of your book and how that conclusion differs in the 6th edition than it has in the previous 5 editions, because that's the important thing. What is to be done?
David, you know I love you, but this wasn't in the script. But I'm good off the cuff. Okay, so David has been pushing me for years to elaborate the what is to be done element. And in this edition, I added two things. First, things that individuals might consider doing themselves as individuals to move away from being just a race liberal or I'm colorblind and become anti-racist individuals. And then the second part, which is deeper, is as good as it is for you to become an anti-racist, is nothing if you don't connect yourself to social movements to change the world. So the second component is the kind of things that you can do to join movements, anti-racist organizations, movements, etc. And I conclude, David, with the discussions of racial nirvana, yeah, based on a paper I wrote 12 years ago on race utopia. What would a world without race and racism sort of be like? So I do that.
I appreciate that. I appreciate that a lot. There's a lot of burning questions out there. I can see it in people's Zoom eyes. I'm just messing around. I can't see anybody's eyes. I can't see anything.
Zoom, I don't know what Zoom
is. So let's get to the Q&A.
Thanks so much, Eduardo and David. That was great. Yeah, we have a ton of questions here, and people should feel free to, keep sending them in. I'm monitoring this. So our first question actually comes from a social worker who's on the call. He asks, what are your suggestions about combining race knowledge and racism to bridge divides with other devalued groups? For example, a Rudderman Foundation study found that in 50% of racist police actions against Blacks, the victims also had disabilities. Ableist tropes are commonly used to stereotype people of color, and over nearly half a century of human rights work and research, ableist attitudes toward disabled folks are commonplace. So I guess, how do you sort of combine that knowledge?
Yeah. Thanks for that question. Obviously, the quest for us in the contemporary moment is that it's not just about race. That's, for example, when I mentioned my definition of racialized social system, I said that it's not just about race, it's about class, gender, sexual orientation, disability, etc. So I think that we know what the answer is the intersectional approach to systems, yeah, and to politics. Now, that is easy said, but hard to do. So what I think needs to happen is, and David, for example, who is a diversity person in his university, knows that although his quest for the last 20 years have been mostly on the race-class nexus, he also addresses gender, disability, etc. So the job is for us, if we happen to be, like me, mostly race color, we got to get educated beyond our comfort zone on in my case, on the race terrain, and deal with the nexus of domination, yeah? So it's not just about race. And the interesting thing is that when you begin reading broadly beyond your comfort zone, whether you are a disabilities expert or a gender expert or a race expert, you are going to find commonalities because oppressions tend to have similarities. So that's my answer.
Yeah, I think that's right. I mean, I think we need to sort of take seriously intersectionality as well as interdisciplinarity, and get outside of sort of knowledge that is sort of U.S. based, right? We really got to get out there, and there's a lot of work that's out there.
Great, thank you both. So our next question, it's a little bit long. In the latest Association of American Medical Colleges graduation questionnaire, 61% of graduating medical students identified as white. Thus, there is no doubt that medical education is a PWI. My current research focuses on mistreatment in the medical learning environment. The most predominant type of mistreatment behaviors are around race and ethnicity, such as unequal training opportunities or racist or ethnically insensitive remarks. Have you entertained the possibility of exploring the white habitus in medical education to see how it contributes to the underrepresentation or attrition of medical students of color?
Absolutely. I'm trying to get a grant with a colleague from UNC precisely to examine the white habitus in the medical field. So this notion travels well, whether it is the medical field, you can go and check a school or a school of public health, or a school of nursing, or a neighborhood, etc. So yes, I'm trying to do that, and as the person posed the question, I have to say that one short story. So there was a book, some of you have seen it, by a person who is now a psychiatrist at Duke, and It was Black Man in a White Coat. I think that was the title. And what he said is that his first exam, he was so happy because he scored 98. So he saw the scores were posted outside the room. He goes to the classroom and the professor told him, hey, why took you so long to be here? And he's like thinking he's going to be congratulated in a strange way. And then the professor started telling him, I've been calling about that light that needed to be fixed for a month, and now is that you come here. So he realized, oh, even though I work hard and I score 98, the professor still thinks I'm just a janitor or a maintenance person.
Okay, great. So our next question actually comes from a student at Slippery Rock University. This student is taking a human diversity class in which Racism Without Racists is the textbook they use. This semester, she's a senior, and she wanted to know a little bit about your thoughts on something that she's been discussing in her class. Do you feel that a diversity class should be mandatory in freshman college classes to ensure that these important topics you discuss in your book are formally taught to everyone in the collegiate level before they enter the workforce as college graduates?
I'm going to go deeper than taking one class, because one class, you know what happens. And we now have some data showing that when students take only one class, there is a lot of resentment. And the students, rather than being a positive experience, it ends up producing negativity. So what we need to think is, if I'm right on my argument about HWCUs, what we need to think is how to restructure these places completely, yeah? Reimagine, reinvent these white spaces to make them truly multicultural. And that means that diversity will not be a class. It will be part of the entire curriculum, on the entire apparatus of the institution, not just in terms of faculty and students and staff, but of the books assigned, who is in the curriculum, etc. So in principle, since I know that this will not happen tomorrow, yeah, the kind of restructuring of HWCUs, I do support mandate. And I remember when I was in Wisconsin studying for minority rights, I'm talking the language of 30 years ago, when we used to call people of color minority people, yeah? So at the time, I supported having mandatory courses and support that today, but I think that ultimately, much like programs like affirmative action, they are necessary but not sufficient. What we need to think is bigger, deeper. We need to think about deep diversity efforts, not cosmetic stuff, you know. David knows more about that than me.
No, I agree. I agree with you in general. I'll just add in, it's hard to dismantle these white institutions. The roots run deep, right? And so, and when contestations about sort of what do we do to decolonize curriculum or decolonize higher education come up, the results are superficial. So one example is like, we recently had the one former president of the American Sociological Association write a book on Du Bois as a scholar denied, right? And it created, it was a good thing to do. It created, a movement in some respects about how, in sociology, the curriculum is typically primarily white men, right? And so there's not a lot of women. So the answer to some, that didn't happen across the board, but a lot of places, the answer to this was just to drop some Du Bois in there, right? So you have the same curriculum, and then, but what about the Ida B. Wells? What about the Anna Julia Coopers? What about those? And so, so these are superficial. So I agree. I think it should be mandatory. I think diversity has, become broadly defined, so that it encapsulates everything but the kitchen sink, right? So, things like perspective. So we have to be very clear and very conscientious about what we're saying when we talk about sort of these mandatory diversity classes. I would rather we have classes on issues of racism, sexism, homotransphobia, and the like, and you can call them whatever, racial diversity, you can call them, but I think we need to sort of move away from these kind of very ambiguous, because you end up getting into, getting deeper into the status quo than actually creating any kind of sense of change.
Thank you for that. Our next question is, how do you make sense of the newest studies that show COVID is now more deadly for white people than it is for people of color? This is not a reverse racism argument, but seems more like a quote unquote dying of whiteness frame to make sense of how racism now intersects with COVID.
Well, the questioner answered his or her question, yeah? Dying of whiteness, yeah? So a segment of the white population has refused vaccination. Are we surprised that they are now achieving parity in mortality rates, yeah? And as we know, this is an untold story in the broad community. Lots of poor whites in this nation, yeah? I live in North Carolina, in the rural part of North Carolina, where folks the masks are not used by anybody in my area but me and my wife, yeah? So we go to Walmart, we go to the stores, and everybody is like the pandemic is over. By the way, as you probably know, there is a rebound happening even as we speak. So therefore, that segment, that reluctant, third of the white population that doesn't want to get vaccinated. Some of them got the first vaccine because they were in jobs that required that, but haven't taken the second, third, fourth yet. So I'm not surprised by that, yeah? And by the way, the person cited this Dying of Whiteness. There is a book with that title, Dying of Whiteness, by Jonathan Metzger, who is a sociologist and a psychiatrist at Vanderbilt University. Good book.
Okay. The next question is, my spouse is a cardiac nurse. The majority of her patients are Black. My spouse, who is white, occasionally hears subtly racist comments from her colleagues. What can she do as a white female to address these issues of racism? What techniques are effective?
I happen to believe that it's time for us to be intentional and to say what we find wrong with this. And we're dealing with matters of life and death, yeah? So not saying something in the face, and I'm not accusing anybody, I'm saying that it's time for us to get beyond the comfort zone and put some strength in our beliefs. And we know something is said that is extremely problematic, racist, etc., that could potentially lead to someone dying or getting a lesser treatment. We have to speak up, yeah? And if not directly to the person, then to the supervisors. There must be a way of doing with this, and of course, job security. I'm not telling the person to quit the job. Yeah, I'm trying to say, I'm assuming the person has some level of job security, but I'll tell you what I did and I have done in my life, independent of job security. David knows this. I have spoken my mind. I have lost jobs and I have not gotten grants and I have gotten, character assassinated in underhanded ways by the enemies of humanity. But I sleep tight at night because I do what I think is right. And on this, I don't compromise. If I see something like that, I would speak up. I would tell it and say, hey, this joke you are making is highly problematic, and we're dealing with a patient experiencing a cardiac arrest or having trauma. You cannot just do that.
Yeah, I think I think it no longer pays to sort of be a bystander, but it also, I would urge a sort of sense of caution, depending on the context, right? I mean, there's some areas in which, you can take action, like you don't want to get killed, like, you see police officers doing something, you obviously want to say it, you want to record it, you want to get involved, but you don't want to get hurt, right? This is different than the medical field where I think you can speak up because you're talking about people's lives here.
That's it. The scalpel is different than the gun.
Okay, so our next question is, can you speak to white habitus as it pertains to people who claim to be progressive and use their quote unquote commitment to diversity to sidestep their unwillingness to address systemic and structural racism in health institutions?
I am like 5 years away from speaking truth and telling some folks who parade as racial progressives, and I know and have data that they're not, that they have said and done things to me and to other scholars of color, yeah? So I think that the worst part is, as I mentioned casually, and now I want to go more systematically, the white habitus is not just for what bad apples, yeah? It's for everybody. Every white person endures a version of the white habitus. So therefore, I'm not surprised that the person claiming to be, think about this, you claim to be a race liberal or a progressive, and then you have the Black Lives Matter sign in your yard, but you live in a white neighborhood, and you claim to be racially progressive, but you still have fundamentally a white network of friends and associates, yeah? And you preach nicely, but everything in your life is oriented towards whiteness. And in the book, I put a hypothetical example of one of these progressives. And I say something like, how do you feel when you hear that Eduardo got the job? That Eduardo makes more money than you? Do you feel that's okay, that's fantastic? Or do you, in the back of your head, you feel like, I should not feel this way. I don't think Eduardo should make more money than me. I mean, he's all right, but he's not that great. He's not that good. And I'm like, and the answer is, I am that good. I am that great, yeah? And then deal with your stuff, yeah? So I think that that is the element, understanding how the white habitus shapes in a deep way, not just RWF, but even the people who claim to be race liberals or racially progressive folks.
Okay, we're down to our last 2 minutes. So Eduardo, I'm going to ask you a question, but you have to answer it really fast. I come from an older generation, and I've seen some of the younger generation waste the opportunity to make a change. What is the one piece of advice that you can give that will make an impact on their decisions?
You got to be quick. For example, the moment that we're living, we had this humongous, unpredicted mobilization after the murder of George Floyd. And unfortunately, part of the beauty of the movement was that it was sort of a little bit unorganized and with a clear set of demands. And the problem was that then the movement, we may have, David, you know this in the academy, we may have missed the time to make the demands and say, okay, now that we have people in the streets, we want A, B, C, D like tomorrow, yeah? Because that lack of organization, the unstructured character of the movement is producing large mobilizations that end up producing cultural change, but not practical stuff. So my advice for young folks is get organized and make sure you get demands put out there that can be delivered and you can get something back.
Great. All right, so we're out of time. Thank you so much to everyone who came today. Eduardo, if you can just click through to the last slide. We are offering Eduardo's book, Racism Without Racists, for 25% off. We'll also throw that code in the chat, but you can purchase the book at roman.com. The code is RLF and F25. And you can also get a bonus chapter that is not included in the book on the roman.com website. And that's all. We'll route a recording of this presentation likely in a few days. And thank you, Eduardo. Thank you, David. And thank you to everyone who came and participated. We were so happy to have you.
Bye-bye.
Bye.